Let's talk about pivot tables and pivot charts. In this chapter, you're going to need to know how to make these and read these and some of the key concepts that go into them. But what in the world are we doing? We're dealing with data. So we need to learn how to deal with tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of data. And what I mean by this is companies like Disney, you think with the Magic Band that they're using, take in so much data on where people are at, what they're doing. Kroger with groceries, Capital One with insurance, or that would be credit cards right there, State Farm with insurance policy. All of this is data on individuals, and we have now terabytes, tons and tons of data, tons of gigabytes of data, and we need to turn this into knowledge right here, and a visualization is going to be the key way to do that. So what is a pivot table? A pivot table is simply a way of putting your data into a table in Excel. Excel's been doing this since the 90s right here, making pivot tables and pivot charts. And we're going to look at some of these ways to aggregate our data and turn it into something that's easier to understand. Now, what I want to point out right here is you get Office free from the university, 100% free right here. So make sure to download Excel. In this moment, you should have Excel downloaded to your computer. And I believe when you log in right here, you'll see it in the top right corner that says like download Office right here. You want to click that and download Office to your computer. Some people have the online, it works kind of okay, but a lot of the features we will be doing, download Microsoft Office to your computer. Make sure to have them. We'll be using Excel. A key thing to understand is that when you create pivot tables and pivot charts, it matters how you enter in your data. Capital Y, lowercase y, YES, capital YES, all those are going to react differently when we have our data in an Excel spreadsheet. So make sure your data has the following format, and you'll see it here in a second, where we have the name of the column at each top right there. Those are the names of the column. And then below you have the rows of data for the first, the second, the third, the fourth individuals right there. Now, I'm also going to send you a playlist. You'll see it in the modules, a playlist going over these steps where you can watch me make pivot charts and pivot tables. When you're doing this, you'll want to go to Insert and then go to Pivot Table, from Table or Arrange. And this is how to do it on a Mac right here. And you can also insert a new worksheet right here. Check out the playlist that shows you the step-by-steps for doing these. If you run into any problems, let me know. We'll also be making these in class, so you'll get to practice along with us, and you'll understand what these are for right here. It's definitely where we make up some test questions, like, what if we wanted to look at class level and GPA of individuals? So you would need to know what goes where. Let's examine those fields. Here's the fields you saw over on the right, but a little easier to see. We have the filter, which is what removes things. We have the rows and columns, which divides it by kind of two different variables. But the values is probably the most important. So if I wanted to look at the GPA of class levels, GPA is the values we are looking at. So GPA would have to go into values. Class level, like freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, could go into either rows or columns. It really doesn't matter. You can pick one or the other, and that will subdivide it. Maybe we want to look at class level and gender, then we would need to choose rows for one and columns for the other, and we want to look at the GPA for those groups. GPA, once again, would go into the values. The main thing I tell people is the value would be the first thing you decide, because that's what you see in a pivot table or pivot chart. You see the values. So when making a pivot table or pivot chart, first decide on the values, then you will subdivide it by either rows or columns, and then the filter is what you want to remove. Like let's say we're looking at class level, but we don't want to look at graduate students, and we have freshmen, sophomore, junior, senior graduate students. You could then filter class level by graduate, like remove graduate students. So filter removes out certain things for you. It's kind of an additional thing. I would say the first thing you do is look at your values. Then you start subdividing. You only have to subdivide either once with rows or columns, and then you would filter down further if you want. So you kind of have a reverse order here of steps. Step 1, choose what you want to show. Step 2, choose how to divide it up into groups. And step 3, remove things. And truthfully, the only thing you have to do is put a value to show when making a pivot table or pivot chart. So the only required one is the values. You can see right here, we are subdividing by gender and fraternity sorority, and we are looking at people's heights. So that is what is going to be displayed in this pivot table. There's the heights of individuals, but there's a problem. Right now, you'll notice we actually have the sum of heights, which is kind of weird. I think if we took all the females who are in a sorority and we added up their heights, it would equal this amount. Not really that much. That is the sum of all the heights. Well, there's a different setting we need to change now. The value field, remember we're talking about the fields right here? The value field has a value field setting. So you need to click either the eyeball on the Mac or right-click it on a PC. You can see it on the drop-down menu. It'll look like a little eye right here, called an eyeball right there, but it looks like an eye on the Mac, or click down the arrow, but you should see something next to the value field that has a setting. We don't a lot of times use sum. You can if you want, but in rare instances, we use it. Usually we're using things like average. So when you click average right here, you can see now the average height of a female in a sorority is 64.84 inches. Now there are some other things going on right here that we need to fix. We want to make sure we have the value displayed correctly, but in addition, we want to make sure we edit the decimals or other things. There are ways of doing this, going under the home right here, and I'll show you, and we have the video links on the add or remove decimals. So one last thing I would do before turning this into a pivot chart is I would format my decimal places. Make sure it looks pretty. We want graphics that convey information that's easy to read. So go under the home and use the minus decimal buttons and check out the video links on how to make it look nice. Once you have it looking nice and perfect right there, you want to go to Insert and then go to Charts. This is one way of doing it. Also, you'll see me in the videos go to Insert Pivot Chart. It just depends on which version you're on and how to do it right here. Some of them use the recommended chart, and other ones you'll just see Insert and then Pivot Chart. Depends on Mac, PC, and version of Excel. So the first thing you want to do to get to a pivot chart is create a pivot table. You have to first make the pivot table, and then you make the pivot chart. Now, the pivot chart can also incorporate its own pivot table. So don't, in your displays, give a pivot table and then a pivot chart. Incorporate your pivot table underneath your pivot chart. This is what a pivot chart looks like. Notice it's very basic right now, and we don't have a lot of the chart elements that we would need. We have a chart title that just says chart title. We don't have axis titles down here. We don't have an axis title over here, and we don't have a data table down below. So what we want to do is we want to go to Add Chart Elements. On some of them, I believe it's on PCs, you will see a plus icon next to it right here, and you can click the plus icon to edit. You can also go to the chart, click on it itself, and then edit it by adding chart elements there on the left side of the screen. Once again, it depends on what version you're using. If you can't find the buttons, let me know immediately, and versions and different PC or Macs can make differences right there. But once you start adding in the chart elements, we can start doing things like making a descriptive chart title right here. We can add in the axes right here. We have a left axis right there. We can put the legend to the right, and we can put in a data table down below. Now notice we have axis title, data table, axis title, descriptive title here. This is what you're going to need in your pivot charts to ace the assignments. 2 axis titles, data table, and also you will need the chart title. One last thing though, you'll need to format the decimals. Once again, I said we have videos, but it's also listed right here on formatting the decimals. You have to go back to your pivot table, highlight the numbers, and then remove the decimals. Make sure to check out the playlist on Canvas for the step-by-steps where I make pivot tables and pivot charts and show you how to change them. Also come to class, and if you're stuck on something, let us know, and we will be able to fix it up. With this right here, the pivot table and the pivot chart are dynamically linked, so anything you make in the pivot table will go over to the pivot chart. Think about making a good visual display that really conveys the knowledge to people. So work on making a nice display that is very appealing to look at. Let's say we want to look at gender, relationship status, and how many kids people planned on having based on those groups. Well, what would be the values? The values would be this variable. Either of these other ones could be rows or columns. You can choose, and it'll change the way it looks a little bit, but those could be rows or columns. Maybe we want to remove the people who are single, then we do some filtering, but nothing in this question states that yet. First off, when you make a pivot table or pivot chart, make sure you know what you're displaying. We're going to look at how many kids people plan on having based on their gender and their relationship status. So you can see right here in the value field, average kids people plan on having. We don't want to see the sum yet. We just want to see on average for these groups. And then rows or columns, as I said, are pretty interchangeable. It does change it to axis and legend when you click on, I think, the pivot chart, but I call it rows and columns at all times. Axis and legends, just rows and columns. And here we are. Once again, we're going to need to update those decimals and also add another descriptive axis over here to tell people this is average kids people plan on having. So think about how you can make it look nicer, like updating the decimals and making sure you make a good pivot chart. So with it a little bit updated right here, we're now looking at something different. We are now looking at the count of individuals in each group. What did we have to change to look at the count of individuals in each group versus the average for the individuals in each group? The value field setting. So changing it over to count lets us see how many individuals are in each group. And what do you notice about the UT population? Well, it's mostly people dating one person, mostly single people. So there's a lot of differences that we can see right here where a lot of people at UT are not in these groups. So this lets us understand how many people were sampled in each group. Last but not least, let's take a look at the data one more time with the maximums. Another thing you might see right here is there is a single individual who's female who wants to have 16 kids. Now, that's their choice. 16 is a lot, but that is what they want. So maybe, but this is a bigger group, but they might influence the mean because they're an outlier. There's an engaged or married individual who is male who wants to have 12 kids, so they're probably inflating their mean because remember that's a smaller group right here with only 15 individuals in that group. So going back to look at the average for that group, you might say maybe the extreme nature of this one group right here, because that group really stands out, is being impacted by the small group size of I think only 15 or 16 individuals and an extreme outlier of 12. So that's going to greatly inflate the mean. Outliers heavily influence the mean right there. So that's why we might see that big spike that's like, what's going on right there? Why is that? Oh, well, there was only 15 people there, and there was one individual out of that 15 who wanted 12 children, and if we average that, they're going to have a stronger influence. So what can we do? We can filter them out. Maybe we don't believe those are rational responses by individuals, and we want to remove those individuals from our analysis. If you notice, we have an 11, 12, 16, we have a few responses at least with those. So we could remove out those values because we think they are kind of absurd values, and then we can relook at our data. Now you'll notice it is a little more close to the other ones. It's actually not the highest group right now, but it brought down the mean a lot because outliers greatly influence the mean. What you're seeing right here is a way to analyze and look at the data, and I do want to point out that we have put the table into one decimal format, which kind of makes sense here because it's how many kids do you plan on having on average for these groups. The decimal differences are going to matter. 1 or 2 decimals would be appropriate here. 3 is kind of stretching it, and 4 is too much. You don't need that much precision. Also, one last thing I want to state is do not include the pivot table and pivot chart because you have the pivot table underneath the pivot chart. So you're actually including it by adding the data table below with the add chart elements. So with this, make some great pivot tables and great pivot charts. Watch the additional videos if you need some step-by-steps. Come to class, and let's make some great graphics.